There's nothing quite like the sound of a mother's quiet prayers when her children are hungry and the world has turned its back on her. On this frozen prairie morning, Delia Morgan whispers such prayers as she holds her twin toddlers close to a dying campfire. Her wagon sits broken nearby, her food nearly gone, and her hands shake from cold and fear. She's trying to reach her late husband's family out west, but the trail shows no mercy to a woman alone with two crying children. Most folks ride past without looking. Then Westin Hale appears through the morning mist. The wealthy heir to the Hale Cattle Empire stops his horse and watches the desperate scene. Something in Delia's quiet strength as she comforts her boys while shivering herself moves him. He dismounts, removes his fine coat, and speaks 3 simple words that will change everything. But what could drive a man known for wealth and whiskey to risk everything for a stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen prairie as Westin Hale studied the scene before him. At 28, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years in the saddle, combined with the refined bearing of a man born to wealth. His dark hair caught the light beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes, a deep brown that some folks in Canyon Ridge called whiskey-colored, held an intensity that made most people step aside when he walked into a room. But now those eyes were fixed on something that stopped him cold. The woman by the campfire couldn't have been much older than himself, though hardship had etched lines around her green eyes that spoke of sorrows beyond her years. Her auburn hair, once probably worn in fashionable ringlets, was now pulled back in a practical braid that had seen too many dusty miles. She wore a faded blue dress that had once been fine but now bore the stains and tears of desperate travel. What struck Westin most was her quiet dignity. Even as she shivered in the morning cold, even as her 2 little boys, they couldn't be more than 3 years old, whimpered against her skirts, she held herself with a grace that wealth couldn't buy and hardship couldn't steal. "Mama," one of the twins whispered, his small voice carrying across the still air. "I'm hungry." The woman Delia, though Westin didn't know her name, yet smoothed the boy's dark hair with a trembling hand. "I know, Tommy. Mama's going to find us something soon." Westin's jaw tightened. He'd heard that particular tone before, the careful optimism of a parent trying to shield their children from harsh reality. His own mother had used it during the lean years after his father's death, before the cattle business had made them rich beyond measure. The broken wagon told its own story. One wheel hung at an impossible angle, the axle cracked clean through. Scattered around the campsite were the remnants of their suppleaser, nearly empty flour sack, a small pot blackened by countless fires, and a few tattered blankets that wouldn't keep a cat warm on a night like the one just past. Westin had been riding since dawn, checking the northern boundaries of the Hale spread. His family owned more land than most men could cross in a week, stretching from the foothills of the Rockies to the edge of the Great Plains. Cattle bearing the Hale brand grazed on 10,000 acres of prime grassland, and the ranch, house built by his grandfather with money from the California gold rush, stood like a monument to American prosperity. But all of that wealth felt hollow as he watched Delia Morgan try to coax life back into her dying fire with the last few pieces of dried buffalo chips. "Stay here," he murmured to his horse, a magnificent black stallion named Thunder, who had cost more than most families saw in a year. The horse nickered softly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Westin approached slowly, not wanting to startle the woman or her children. His boots crunched on the frozen ground, and Delia looked up, with eyes that held equal measures of hope and wariness. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Westin Hale. Looks like you've run into some trouble." Delia's hand instinctively moved to gather her boys closer. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. I'm Delia Morgan, and these are my sons, Tommy and Jamie." Her voice carried the cultured tones of an educated woman, though it was rough with cold and exhaustion. "We're managing well enough." The lie hung between them like morning mist. Westin could see the desperate calculation in her eyes. Was this stranger a threat or a potential salvation? He'd grown up in a world where his name opened doors and his money solved problems, but here on the frozen prairie, facing a woman whose pride was about all she had left, he found himself choosing his words with unusual care. "Where are you headed, Mrs. Morgan?" "West," she said simply, "to Colorado Territory. My late husband's brother has a homestead there." The twins pressed closer to their mother, their eyes wide as they studied the tall stranger. They were identical in every way, the same dark hair as their mother, the same green eyes, the same solemn expression that seemed far too old for such young faces. Westin crouched down to their level, a gesture that surprised even him. "Hello there, boys. Those are fine horses on your mama's wagon." Tommy, the bolder of the two, pointed at the broken wheel. "It's hurt bad." "I can see that," Westin said seriously. "Must have been quite a bump." "Hit a rock," Jamie whispered, speaking for the first time. "Big rock." Delia's composure cracked just slightly. "We were traveling at night, trying to make up time. I didn't see it until too late." Westin stood, his mind racing. The nearest town was Canyon Ridge, a hard day's ride south. The nearest homestead was his own ranch, 4 hours due east. This woman and her children wouldn't survive another night on the open prairie, not with winter closing in and no proper shelter. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need to speak plainly. Your wagon's not going anywhere without major repairs, and even if it was, the next supply station is 3 days hard travel. You've got no food, no warm clothes, and winter's coming early this year." Delia's chin lifted defiantly. "We'll manage, Mr. Hale. We've managed this far." "I'm sure you have," he said, admiration clear in his voice. "But managing and surviving are two different things, and these boys need more than managing right now." The fire chose that moment to die completely, the last ember winking out in a tiny puff of smoke. In the sudden silence, one of the twins began to cry, not the loud wail of a tantrum, but the quiet, hopeless sobbing of a child who'd learned that crying didn't bring comfort. Westin felt something crack inside his chest. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy kawata, fine wool garment lined with sheepskin that had cost more than most men made in a month, and draped it around Delia's shoulders. "Mr. Hale, I can't." "You can, and you will," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But then he softened it with a slight smile. "Besides, I've got more coats at home than I know what to do with." The coat engulfed her small frame, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Westin saw her shiver with relief rather than cold. The twins stopped crying, drawn by the sudden warmth radiating from their mother. "Mrs. Morgan," Westin said, his decision made, "I'm going to ask you to trust me. I know you don't know me from Adam, and I know you've got every reason to be cautious. But I'm offering you and your boys shelter, food, and warmth. No strings attached, no expectations, just human kindness." Delia studied his face for a long moment, searching for some sign of deception or ulterior motive. What she saw there, honesty, compassion, and a surprising vulnerability, made her breath catch. "Why?" she asked simply. Westin was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because," he said finally, "I've got more than I need, and you've got less than you deserve. And because—" He paused, looking at the twins who were now peeking out from beneath his coat. "Because sometimes the trail leads us to exactly where we need to be." He held out his hand to her, palm up, an invitation and a promise all in one. Delia looked at that outstretched hand, then at her children, then back at the man who'd appeared out of the morning mist like an answer to prayer. She thought of her late husband Samuel, who'd always said that kindness was the rarest currency in the world and should be accepted when offered genuinely. "Follow me home," Westin said quietly, and somehow those 3 simple words contained everything: safety, hope, and the promise of something better than mere survival. With a prayer on her lips and her children's futures in her heart, Delia Morgan placed her hand in his. The Hale ranch materialized out of the prairie like something from a dream. Delia had seen grand houses before her, own father had been a banker in St. Louisville, nothing quite like the sprawling complex that rose before them as they crested the final hill. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built of golden sandstone that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in warm, welcoming waves. Wide porches wrapped around both the first and second floors, supported by columns that spoke of southern elegance transplanted to the western frontier. But it was the little details that caught Delia's attention as they rode closer. Flower boxes beneath the windows, still bright with late-season blooms despite the approaching winter. A carefully tended garden, visible around the side of the house. Fences painted white and kept in perfect repair. This wasn't just wealth, this was a home. "Mama, look at the horses," Tommy whispered from his perch in front of Westin on Thunder's broad back. The boy had taken to their rescuer with the easy trust of childhood, while Jamie rode more quietly with Delia on Westin's pack horse. Indeed, the horses were magnificent. In the near pasture, a dozen mares and their foals grazed peacefully, their coats gleaming with health and good care. Beyond them, Delia could see cattle scattered across rolling hills that seemed to stretch to the horizon. "How much land do you own?" she asked, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "About 10,000 acres in the main spread," Westin replied matter-of-factly. "My grandfather started with a quarter section and just kept adding to it. Said a man needed room to breathe." 10,000 acres. Delia tried to comprehend such vastness. Her late husband, Samuel, had dreamed of owning 40 acres someday, enough for a small farm and a modest life. This was beyond anything she'd ever imagined. As they approached the house, people began emerging from various buildings. Ranch hands paused in their work to stare at the unusual procession. A woman in a white apron, clearly the housekeeper, stepped out onto the front porch, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she took in the travel-worn woman and children. "Mrs. Henderson," Westin called as he dismounted, then reached up to help Tommy down. "We'll be needing rooms prepared for Mrs. Morgan and her boys. The blue suite upstairs should do nicely." The housekeeper, a sturdy woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, hurried down the steps. "Of course, Mr. Westin. But perhaps the lady would prefer to freshen up first. The children look like they could use some warm milk and biscuits." Delia slid down from her horse, her legs unsteady after hours in the saddle. She pulled the worn photograph of Samuel from her Paquita habit she'd developed since his death, touching the small daguerreotype whenever she felt overwhelmed or uncertain. The image was faded now, the edges soft with handling, but his gentle face still brought her comfort. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Mrs. Morgan and her sons, Tommy and Jamie," Westin said formally. "They'll be staying with us for a while." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but she bobbed a quick curtsy. "Welcome to the Hale Ranch, Mrs. Morgan. I'm Sarah Henderson, and I help keep this place running." "Thank you," Delia managed, suddenly aware of how she must look travel, stained, exhausted, clutching a faded photograph like a talisman. "I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Westin said firmly. "Mrs. Henderson, please see that a fire is built in the nursery. The boys will need warmth tonight." "The nursery, sir?" Mrs. Henderson looked puzzled. The nursery had been closed for years, ever since Westin's young nephew had outgrown it during his last visit. "Yes, the nursery. And please ask Cookie to prepare something hot for dinner, something a child would enjoy." As they climbed the front steps, Delia caught sight of movement in the windows of neighboring houses, visible in the distance. Word was already spreading, she realized. The eligible bachelor Westin Hale had brought home a woman and children. By tomorrow, it would be the talk of Canyon Ridge. The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. Rich carpets covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings in heavy frames lined the walls. A grandfather clock ticked solemnly in the entrance hall, its sound echoing off the high ceilings. Everything spoke of prosperity, stability, and permanence, things that had felt like impossible dreams just hours ago. "Mr. Westin," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "perhaps I should mention that your uncle was expecting you for dinner tomorrow evening, the Riverside Hotel dining room, 7 o'clock. Westin paused on the staircase. Send my regrets, Mrs. Henderson. Family business will keep me home. Delia felt her cheeks burn. She wasn't family. Not really, yet Westin had spoken the words with such natural authority that even she almost believed them. The blue suite was magnificent, a sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a four-poster bed that could sleep a family, and an adjoining smaller room that Mrs. Henderson quickly designated as perfect for the twins. Within minutes, maids appeared with hot water, fresh linens, and armloads of firewood. "I've taken the liberty of laying out some clothes," Mrs. Henderson said to Delia. "My daughter left some things behind when she married. You're about the same size, I think." Delia looked at the simple but clean dress, spread across the bed, dark blue wool with a white collar, practical but respectable. After weeks in her travel-stained morning dress, it looked like the height of luxury. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand something," Delia said quietly after the maids had left. "I have no money to pay for any of this. Mr. Hale has been incredibly kind, but I can't accept charity indefinitely." The older woman studied her with sharp but not unkind eyes. "Mrs. Morgan, I've worked for the Hale family for 15 years. Mr. Westin isn't given to impulse, and he's not a man who does things halfway. If he's brought you here, he has his reasons, and I suspect they're good ones." Before Delia could respond, a commotion erupted from the twins' room. She rushed through the connecting door to find both boys standing slack-jawed in the center of a room that had been transformed. A fire crackled merrily in a small fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls painted with pastoral scenes. Two small beds had been made up with thick quilts and feather pillows. But most amazing of all, the room was filled with toys, wooden horses, building blocks, picture books, and a rocking horse that looked hand-carved. "Mama," Tommy breathed, "is this really for us?" Before Delia could answer, Westin appeared in the doorway. He'd changed from his riding clothes into a clean shirt and vest, and she was struck again by how handsome he was and how far above her station. "I hope it's suitable," he said, his voice holding a note of uncertainty that seemed at odds with his usual confidence. "I wasn't sure what boys their age would like." "It's beautiful," Delia whispered, watching her sons explore their new surroundings with wonder. "But Mr. Hale, this is too much. We can't possibly." "You can and you will," he said firmly, then softened his tone. "Mrs. Morgan, when was the last time those boys had a proper meal and a warm bed?" Delia's throat tightened. "Before Samuel died, before we lost the farm." "Then they're overdue." Westin crouched down as the twins approached him shyly. "What do you boys think? Will this room do for tonight?" "It's the most beautiful room in the whole world," Jamie said solemnly, and Westin's face creased in a smile that transformed his entire countenance. "Well then, that's settled. Mrs. Henderson has Cookie preparing dinner, and tomorrow we'll see about getting your mama some work to do around here. Can't have idle hands on a working ranch." Delia's head snapped up. "Work? Of course. You'll earn your keep, same as anyone else. I need someone to manage the household accounts. Mrs. Henderson's a wonder with everything else, but numbers aren't her strong suit. If you're agreeable, that is." The relief that flooded through Delia was so intense it nearly buckled her knees. Work. Honest work, not charity. A way to contribute, to maintain her dignity while accepting help. "I'd be very grateful for the work, Mr. Hale." "Westin," he corrected gently. "And it's I who should be grateful. You'll be doing me a real service." As evening fell and the twins were tucked into their new beds, clean, fed, and warm for the first time in weeks, Delia stood at the window of her sitting room and looked out over the vast ranch lands. In the distance, she could see the lights of other houses, other families settling in for the night. But here, in this grand house with its unexpected kindness, she felt something she'd thought lost forever: hope. The photograph of Samuel rested on the dresser beside her, and for the first time since his death, she didn't feel guilty about the possibility of happiness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. The community would have questions, expectations, judgments. But tonight, her children were safe and warm, and the man who'd made it possible was downstairs reading in his study, as natural and comfortable as if they'd always belonged here. Perhaps, Delia thought as she finally allowed herself to rest. Perhaps they did. 3 weeks had passed since Delia's arrival at the Hale ranch, and she was beginning to understand the true scope of Westin's business empire. Seated at the polished oak desk in the ranch office, she ran her finger down the columns of the leather-bound ledger book, marveling at the complexity of the operation she was now helping to manage. The ledger itself was a thing of beauty-thick, cream-colored pages bound in supple brown leather, with brass corners that gleamed in the morning light. Each page was meticulously ruled, though the previous bookkeeper's handwriting had grown increasingly erratic over the past year, making it difficult to track expenses and income properly. Mrs. Henderson wasn't exaggerating when she said numbers weren't her strong suit. Delia murmured to herself, making careful corrections to a column that had been miscalculated by nearly $200. The office door opened, and Westin entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the comfortable expression of a man in his own domain. Over the past weeks, Delia had come to appreciate these morning meetings, when they would review the ranch business together before the day's demands pulled them in different directions. "Finding more of Morrison's mistakes?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Morrison had been the previous bookkeeper, an elderly man whose eyesight had been failing faster than his pride would allow him to admit. "Several," Delia confirmed, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was a small intimacy that had developed between them. Westin always remembered exactly how she liked her coffee, with just a touch of cream and no sugar. "The good news is that you're actually showing a larger profit than you realized. The bad news is that you've been overpaying for feed grain by about 15%. Westin leaned back in his chair, studying her with those whiskey-colored eyes. "How do you know so much about ranch economics?" "Most bankers' daughters wouldn't recognize a fair price for feed if it bit them." Delia smiled, the first truly relaxed smile he'd seen from her. "Samuel and I spent our first 2 years of marriage on his parents' farm in Kansas. I learned to keep the books there, and I learned that every penny counted. A farmer who doesn't know what his supplies should cost won't stay a farmer long." "Your husband was a fortunate man," Westin said quietly. The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Delia felt her cheeks warm as she returned her attention to the ledger, but not before she caught the way Westin was looking at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with business matters. "The twins seemed to be settling in well," he said, changing the subject with the careful consideration of a man who'd noticed her discomfort. Indeed they were. From her position at the desk, Delia could see out the window to where Tommy and Jamie were playing in the ranch yard under the watchful eye of Mrs. Henderson. They wore new, clothes-practical wool pants and warm shirts that Westin had somehow procured from Townend for the first time in months. They looked like the carefree children they were meant to be. "They've never had so much space to run," Delia said, watching Tommy chase one of the barn cats around a fence post, "or so many people who seemed genuinely fond of them." This was true. The ranch hands had taken to the twins with surprising enthusiasm. Old Pete, the stable master, had appointed himself their instructor in all things horse-related, despite the boys being far too young to ride. Cookie, the ranch cook, always seemed to have fresh biscuits or apple slices ready when they wandered into his domain. Even the other household, Staff the maids, the gardener, the men who maintained the building shed, embraced the children's presence with warmth that spoke well of Westin's leadership. "Children belong on a ranch," Westin said, and there was something wistful in his voice. "The place has felt more alive with them here." Delia looked up from the ledger to find him watching the twins through the window, his expression soft and unguarded. It was a side of him she was seeing more often, the man beneath the wealthy rancher's exterior, someone who was surprisingly gentle and unexpectedly lonely. "Westin," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer." He turned his full attention to her, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest that she'd been trying to ignore for days. "Of course. Why are you doing this? Really? I'm grateful beyond words, but I need to understand. Men in your position don't typically rescue widows and orphans unless they expect something in return." Westin was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Do you know what my grandfather used to tell me when I was about your boy's age? He said that wealth was like water, it only had value when it was flowing. Keep it dammed up, and it becomes stagnant. Let it flow where it's needed, and it brings life to everything it touches." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of his holdings. "I've got more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, Delia. More land than I can properly use. But until 3 weeks ago, I couldn't tell you the last time any of it brought me real satisfaction." "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I come home each evening to the sound of children's laughter. I see you at this desk, bringing order to chaos and taking pride in honest work. I watch my household staff fussing over the twins like they're their own grandchildren." He turned back to her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "For the first time in my adult life, this place feels like a home instead of just a house." The honesty in his words was almost overwhelming. Delia set down her pen and really looked at him, this man who'd appeared out of nowhere to save her family, who asked for nothing in return except the pleasure of their company. "You're a good man, Westin Hale," she said quietly. "I'm trying to be," he replied. "Your presence here makes that easier." Before either of them could explore the implications of that statement, the office door burst open and Tommy came barreling in, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Westin, old Pete says you're going to teach us to ride horses when we get bigger. Is that true? Can we really?" Westin's face broke into a grin as he crouched down to the boy's level. "Well, that depends. Are you going to listen to everything old Pete tells you about how to act around horses?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said solemnly. "Jamie and me, we're going to be the best horse riders in the whole world." "I don't doubt it," Westin said seriously. "But first you need to learn that horses are big and strong, and they deserve respect. Can you remember that?" "Yes, sir. Respect for horses. Jamie, come here." As the twins chatted excitedly about their future equestrian careers, Delia watched Westin interact with them. He had a natural way with children, patient, attentive, never talking down to them, but always maintaining the gentle authority they needed. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of male influence her boys had been missing since Samuel's death. The thought should have brought sadness, but instead it brought something else, warmth that started in her chest and spread outward until she had to look away from the domestic scene to maintain her composure. Later that afternoon, as she worked alone in the office while the twins napped, Delia allowed herself to think about the growing feelings she'd been trying to suppress. It would be easy to fall in love with Westin Hale too, easy. He was handsome, kind, generous, and wonderful with her children. But she was also realistic enough to know that whatever was developing between them existed in a bubble of circumstances that couldn't last forever. She was a widow with no fortune and 2 young children. He was one of the wealthiest men in the territory, with social obligations and expectations that didn't include taking in strays from the prairie. Eventually, reality would intrude, and when it did, she needed to be prepared to protect not only her own heart, but her children's as well. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the window. Westin was returning from his afternoon ride, and as had become his habit, he paused in the yard to wave up at the office window before heading to the stable. It was a small gesture, but it never failed to make her smile. Perhaps, she thought as she waved back, she was borrowing trouble by worrying about the future. Perhaps it was enough, for now, to simply accept the gift of this time, the safety, the warmth, the growing certainty that whatever had brought Westin Hale into their lives, it was exactly what they all needed. The ledger lay open before her, its neat columns telling the story of a prosperous ranch and a generous man. But increasingly, Delia found herself hoping it might also be the beginning of a different kind of story, entirely one where a family could be built not just on blood and law, but on choice and love and the simple courage to trust in unexpected kindness. The evening air carried the scent of approaching winter as Westin sat on the front porch, his hands moving steadily over a piece of pine wood. The rhythmic scraping of his knife against the grain was soothing, almost meditative, and the small horse taking shape beneath his fingers bore witness to skills he'd learned as a boy, but rarely had reason to use. "That's beautiful work," Delia said softly from the doorway. She'd come looking for him after putting the twins to bed, drawn by the sound of his whittling and the warm glow of the porch lantern. Westin looked up, his face creasing in a smile that had become as natural as breathing when she was near. "My grandfather taught me. Said a man should know how to make something useful with his hands, no matter how much money he had in the bank." Delia settled into the chair beside him, noting the small pile of wood shavings at his feet and the careful attention he was paying to the toy's details. "The boys will love it. They've never had anything so fine. Every child should have proper toys," Westin said, his knife pausing in its work. "I've been thinking about making them a whole set horses, cattle, maybe a little ranch house, something they can play with together." The thoughtfulness of it touched Delia deeply. In the weeks since their arrival, she'd watched Westin gradually open himself to her children, moving from polite kindness to genuine affection with a naturalness that spoke to his fundamental character. "You don't have to do so much for them," she said quietly. "You've already given us more than we ever dreamed of." "I know I don't have to," Westin replied, resuming his carving. "I want to, that's the difference." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the whisper of steel against wood and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Delia found herself thinking about how different her life had become in such a short time. "Westin," she said eventually, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Have you ever wanted children of your own?" His hands stilled, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped. But then he set down his knife and leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning toward the horizon. "I used to think I did," he said slowly. "When I was younger, I had it all planned. Outmarry well, have sons to carry on the family name, build something lasting. But the years passed, and somehow it never happened." "Why not?" Westin was quiet for so long that Delia began to regret asking. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old disappointments. "I suppose I never met anyone who loved me more than they loved what I could give them. Hard to build a family on that foundation." The sadness in his words made Delia's chest tighten. She'd begun to understand, in their time together, that Westin's wealth was both blessing and burden opening doors, but also creating barriers, attracting attention, but making genuine connection nearly impossible. "That must be very lonely," she said softly. "It was," he admitted, "until recently." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Delia felt her heart speed up, aware that they were approaching territory that neither of them had dared explore openly. "Westin." "Mama," Tommy's voice called from inside the house, high and distressed. "Mama, come quick." Delia was on her feet instantly, rushing through the front door with Westin close behind. They found Tommy standing in the hallway in his nightshirt, tears streaming down his face. "What is it, sweetheart?" Delia knelt beside him, checking for injury. "Jamie won't wake up," Tommy sobbed. "I tried and tried, but he won't wake up." Delia's blood turned to ice as she raced to the twins' room, Westin right behind her. Jamie lay in his bed, unnaturally still, his breathing shallow and labored. His face was flushed with fever, and when Delia pressed her hand to his forehead, the heat nearly burned her palm. "He was fine at bedtime," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "He was perfectly fine." Westin moved quickly to the boy's bedside, his face grim as he assessed Jamie's condition. "Mrs. Henderson," he called sharply. "Mrs. Henderson, come quickly." The housekeeper appeared within moments, still tying her robe. One look at Jamie's condition had her taking charge with the calm efficiency of a woman who'd seen illness before. "Fever's bad," she said, feeling the child's pulse. "We need to get his temperature down. Cold cloths, lots of them, and send someone for Dr. Mitchell in town." "I'll go myself," Westin said, already heading for the door. "No," Delia's voice stopped him. "Please don't leave us. Send one of the ranch hands. I need—" Her voice broke as Jamie stirred restlessly, murmuring incoherently. Westin understood immediately. Without hesitation, he called for Pete, who appeared with remarkable speed for a man his age. "Ride hard for town," Westin instructed. "Bring Dr. Mitchell back with you. Tell him it's Argenta child with high fever." As Pete hurried away, Mrs. Henderson organized the household staff with military precision. Cool cloths appeared, along with basins of water and extra blankets. The twins' room became a hive of quiet, purposeful activity, everyone working together with the kind of unity that spoke to their genuine care for the family. Delia sat beside Jamie's bed, holding his small hand and whispering soft reassurances, even though he couldn't hear her. Tommy pressed close against her side, his own face pale with fear for his twin. "Is Jamie gonna die like Papa did?" Tommy whispered, the question that Delia herself was afraid to voice. "No," Westin said firmly, settling into a chair on the other side of the bed. "Jamie's going to be fine. Sometimes children get fevers, but Dr. Mitchell will know exactly what to do." "Promise?" Tommy's lower lip trembled. Westin looked at the scared little boy, then at Delia's terrified face, and made a decision that surprised them all. "I promise," he said solemnly, "and I always keep my promises." The next few hours passed in a blur of worry and waiting. Dr. Mitchell arrived near midnight, a competent man in his 50s who examined Jamie thoroughly before pronouncing it a severe case of influenza that was making the rounds in town. "The fever should break by morning," he assured them. "Keep him cool, give him sips of water when he'll take them, and watch for signs of breathing difficulty. Children this age usually recover quickly, but the next few hours are critical." Delia refused to leave Jamie's bedside, and Westin refused to leave Delia. As the night wore on, they took turns cooling the boy's fever and comforting Tommy, who'd insisted on staying close to his twin despite everyone's efforts to convince him to sleep in another room. Near dawn, as the first pale light began to filter through the windows, Jamie's fever finally broke. His breathing eased, his color improved, and when he opened his eyes and asked for water in a weak but clear voice, Delia burst into tears of relief. "There now," Westin said softly, his own voice rough with emotion. "Didn't I tell you he'd be fine?" As Jamie drifted into natural sleep and Tommy finally allowed himself to be convinced to rest, Delia found herself alone with Westin in the quiet room. The wooden horse he'd been carving sat on the dresser, forgotten in the night's crisis, but somehow more precious now for the love and care it represented. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything she couldn't express. Gratitude for his presence, his calm strength, his willingness to make promises to a frightened child, and then do everything in his power to keep them. "No need for thanks," Westin replied. "This is what families do, they take care of each other." Families. The words settled around them like a warm blanket, encompassing all the hopes and fears and growing love that none of them had dared to name. As the sun rose over the Hale ranch, painting the windows with golden light, Delia finally understood what she'd been afraid to admit to herself. Somewhere between that first, desperate morning by the dying campfire and this long night of shared worry, they'd become exactly what Westin had called Thema family. Not bound by blood or law, but by something perhaps even stronger: choice, and love, and the simple courage to care for one another through whatever storms might come. The silver locket had been her wedding gift from Samuel, and Delia wore it every day like a talisman against forgetting. Inside the ornate oval case were two tiny photographs of Tommy and one of Jamie, taken shortly after their second birthday when they'd still been living on the farm. The images were small enough to fit against her heart, and she touched the locket often, especially during moments when the present felt too good to trust. This morning was one of those moments. Standing at the kitchen window, she watched Westin in the far pasture with her sons, teaching them the basics of horse handling with a patience that never seemed to wear thin. Tommy held the lead rope of a gentle mare named Daisy, while Westin demonstrated the proper way to brush her coat. Jamie, fully recovered from his bout with influenza 2 weeks prior, sat perched on a fence rail, asking what appeared to be an endless stream of questions. "He's wonderful with them," Mrs. Henderson observed, joining Delia at the window with a cup of tea. The housekeeper had become something of a confidant over the past weeks, offering both practical assistance and motherly wisdom. "He is," Delia agreed, her fingers finding the locket automatically. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is real." "And why shouldn't it be real?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. "You're a good woman, Mrs. Morgan. You work hard, you're raising fine boys, and you've brought something to this house that's been missing for far too long." "What's that?" "Joy," the older woman said simply. "Mr. Westin's been going through the motions of living for years, but he hasn't truly been happy, not until you and the boys arrived." Delia knew this was true. In quiet moments, she'd caught glimpses of the man Westin might have been if circumstances had been different, if wealth hadn't isolated him, if social expectations hadn't constrained him, if he'd found love earlier in life. With her children, those barriers seemed to dissolve entirely. "Mrs. Henderson," Delia said carefully, "what do people in town say about our being here?" The housekeeper's expression grew thoughtful. "Some talk, of course. Always do when anything changes. But most folks see how content Mr. Westin is, how well the boys are thriving. Hard to argue with results like that." "And the others?" "Well," Mrs. Henderson sighed, "there are always those who think they know how other people should live their lives, but Mr. Westin's never been one to let gossip dictate his actions." As if summoned by their conversation, Westin appeared at the kitchen door with both boys in tow. All three of them were dusty from their morning with the horses, and Tommy was chattering excitedly about the proper way to check a hoof for stones. "Mama, did you know that horses can get rocks stuck in their feet just like we get stones in our shoes?" he announced, rushing to her side. "I did not know that," Delia said solemnly, smoothing his hair. "That sounds very important to remember." "Mr. Westin says we're almost ready to sit on Daisy's back," Jamie added, his green eyes bright with anticipation. "But we have to learn all the ground rules first." "Safety first," Westin confirmed, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Henderson. "No point in getting on a horse if you don't understand how to communicate with them properly." Watching him interact with her children, Delia felt the familiar warmth in her chest that had been growing stronger each day. He'd purchased child-sized brushes for the boys to use with the horses, had commissioned a local craftsman to make them small wooden stools so they could reach higher on the animals, and had spent countless hours answering their questions with the kind of attention usually reserved for adult pupils. "I hate to interrupt the riding lessons," Delia said, "but you have that meeting with the cattle buyers this afternoon." Westin's expression shifted, becoming more businesslike. "Right. I'd forgotten." He turned to the twins. "We'll continue tomorrow, boys. Same time, same place." "Yes, sir," they chorused, then raced off to find Mrs. Henderson's cat, who'd become their frequent playmate. Alone for a moment, Westin and Delia stood together in comfortable silence. These small domestic moments had become precious to both of them, brief interludes where the outside world seemed far away, and the growing connection between them felt natural and right. "How are the account books coming along?" Westin asked, settling into the role of employer, though his tone held warmth that transcended mere business. "Nearly caught up," Delia reported. "I found several more discrepancies that work in your favor. I think you'll be pleased with the final numbers." "I'm already pleased," he said quietly, and the way he looked at her suggested they weren't talking about bookkeeping anymore. Before either could explore that thought further, a commotion erupted from the front yard. Through the window, they could see a fancy carriage approaching the house, its polished black paint and brass fittings speaking of money and social position. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Westin, you have visitors. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth and her mother." Delia felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard the name Victoria Ashworth in passing, daughter of a prominent banking family from Denver, beautiful, accomplished, and according to local gossip, the woman everyone expected Westin to marry, eventually. Westin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Show them to the parlor, Mrs. Henderson. I'll be along presently." "Of course, sir." The housekeeper disappeared, leaving Westin and Delia alone with the sudden tension that had filled the room. "I should go," Delia said quickly, already moving toward the back stairs. I have work to finish in the office. Delia, wait. Westin's hand caught her arm gently. You don't have to hide. This is your home too. But even as he said the words, they both knew they weren't entirely true. This was Westin's home, and Delia was here by his grace and kindness. Women like Victoria Ashworth belonged in parlours, receiving formal visits. Women like Delia belonged in kitchens and offices, useful but invisible. I know, she said softly, touching the locket at her throat, but it's better this way, for everyone. 20 minutes later, Delia was trying to concentrate on ledger entries when the sound of feminine laughter drifted up from the parlour below. Victoria Ashworth had a lovely laugh, melodious and cultured, the kind that belonged at society gatherings and charity events. The kind that reminded Delia of everything she'd lost when Samuel died, and everything she'd never be able to give Westin. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Tommy peered around the office door, his expression unusually subdued. "Mama, there's a fancy lady downstairs asking about us." Delia's blood chilled. "What kind of questions, sweetheart?" "She wanted to know our names and how long we've been here, and if we're Mr. Westin's relations." Tommy climbed into her lap, seeking comfort. "She didn't seem very nice, Mama." Her smile was cold. Before Delia could respond, Westin's voice carried up the stairs, polite but firm. "I'm afraid I must disagree, Victoria. Mrs. Morgan and her children are welcome here for as long as they choose to stay." "Really, Westin?" came a woman's voice, smooth as silk, but with an edge underneath. "Everyone's talking. It's simply not appropriate for a man in your position to be harboring strays. What will people think?" The casual cruelty of the word strays hit Delia like a physical blow. She set Tommy gently aside and moved to close the office door, but not before Westin's response reached her ears. "I care very little what people think, Victoria, and I'd ask you to speak respectfully about guests in my home." "Guests," Victoria repeated, and even from upstairs, Delia could hear the skepticism. "How long do guests typically stay, Westin? Because from what I understand, this woman and her children have been here for over a month." The conversation continued, but Delia couldn't bear to hear more. She gathered Tommy close and went to find Jamie, who was building block towers in their sitting room, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding downstairs. "Boys," she said carefully, "how would you feel about taking a walk outside? We could visit the horses." An hour later, Westin found them in the stable, where old Pete was teaching the twins to braid rope while Delia sat nearby, her face carefully composed, but her hands trembling slightly as she worked on some mending. "They're gone," he said without preamble. Delia looked up, searching his face for clues about how the visit had concluded. "I hope we didn't cause you any embarrassment." "You?" Westin's eyebrows rose. "Delia, you have nothing to apologize for. Victoria Ashworth, on the other hand, will not be welcome here again until she learns some manners." Despite herself, Delia felt a flicker of hope. "You sent her away?" "I did." Westin settled beside her on the hay bale, close enough that she could smell his familiar scent of leather and soap. "But I won't lie to you, her visit was a reminder that the outside world has opinions about our arrangement here." "What kind of opinions?" Westin was quiet for a moment, watching the twins practice their rope work with old Pete's patient guidance. "Some people believe that a wealthy bachelor shouldn't be living under the same roof as an unmarried woman, regardless of the circumstances. Others think I'm being taken advantage of. And a few seem to believe that I'm somehow compromising your reputation by offering you shelter." The unfairness of it made Delia's chest tight with anger. "So we're damned if we stay and damned if we go." "Not we," Westin said firmly. "Me. I'm the one who has to decide whether I care more about what other people think or about what makes me happy." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Delia turned to study his face, seeing something there that made her heart race, despite her efforts to remain practical. "And what makes you happy, Westin?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. "Coming home each evening to the sound of children's laughter, watching you bring order and purpose to work that had become routine. Seeing the twins grow stronger and more confident each day." He paused, then added quietly, knowing that whatever else happens in my day, you'll be here when it ends." The honesty in his words took her breath away. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Westin, I need you to understand something. I care about you more than I should, probably. But I won't be the reason you lose the respect of your community or damage relationships that matter to you." "What if those relationships don't matter as much as I once thought?" he asked. "What if I've learned the difference between people who care about me and people who care about what I represent?" Before Delia could answer, Tommy came running over with his finished rope braid, proud as could be of his handiwork. "Look, Mama, look, Mr. Westin, old Pete says I'm a natural." "That's beautiful work," Westin said seriously, examining the braid with the attention it deserved. "You'll be a real cowboy before we know it." As the afternoon wore on and the twins continued their lessons, Delia found herself thinking about Victoria Ashworth's visit and what it represented. The woman had been beautiful, polished, everything a man in Westin's position was supposed to want. But she'd also been cold, calculating, and quick to dismiss the value of anyone she considered beneath her station. The contrast couldn't have been clearer, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Delia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had something to offer that money and social position couldn't buy: genuine affection, shared values, and the kind of quiet contentment that came from building something real together. That evening, as they sat on the front porch after the twins had gone to bed, Westin resumed work on his latest carving project, a small wooden ranch house, to go with the horses and cattle he'd already completed. The domestic scene felt precious and fragile, like something that could be destroyed by the wrong word or a moment's carelessness. "Victoria was right about one thing," Delia said finally. "People are talking." "Let them talk," Westin replied, not looking up from his work. "I've been the subject of gossip my entire adult life. At least now it's about something that actually matters. What if it gets worse? What if it affects your business relationships?" Westin set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "Delia, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. I have land, cattle, and business relationships that are built on mutual profit, not social approval. What I don't have, what I've never had until now, was a reason to come home that has nothing to do with duty or obligation." He reached for her hand, holding it gently but firmly. "You and the boys have given me that reason, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let a bunch of small-minded gossips take it away." In the growing darkness, with the locket warm against her heart and Westin's hand steady in hers, Delia finally allowed herself to believe that maybe some dreams were worth fighting for after all. The engagement ring had been his grandmother's stunning diamond, surrounded by sapphires, set in white gold that caught the light like captured starfire. Westin turned it over in his hands now, sitting alone in his study long after the household had gone to sleep, remembering the day he'd given it to Victoria Ashworth 3 years ago. It had been expected, that engagement. Their families had moved in the same circles for decades, their financial interests were aligned, and Victoria was everything a man in his position was supposed to want in a wife: beautiful, accomplished, connected to all the right people. The fact that their relationship had been more business arrangement than love story had seemed irrelevant at the time, until Victoria had broken it off 6 months later to marry a railroad heir from San Francisco, leaving Westin with wounded pride and a growing realization that he'd felt more relief than heartbreak. Now, 3 years later, the ring sat in his desk drawer like an accusation, a reminder of the life he was expected to live and the choices he was expected to make. Victoria's unexpected visit that afternoon had stirred up memories he'd thought long buried, along with uncomfortable questions about what he really wanted for his future. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, quickly returning the ring to its velvet box. Delia appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple white nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her auburn hair was loose around her face, and she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than she did during the busy hours of the day. "I saw the light under your door," she said quietly. "I couldn't sleep either." Bad dreams? He asked, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Something like that. She settled into the chair, pulling the shawl closer. Jamie had a nightmare about being back on the trail with no food. It took a while to calm him down. Westin's chest tightened. Despite their weeks of safety and comfort, the twins still carried scars from their time of desperation. It was a reminder of how precarious their situation had been, and how much they had to lose if circumstances changed. "He'll be all right," Westin said gently. "Children are resilient. The nightmares will fade as the good memories pile up." "I hope so." Delia was quiet for a moment, then added, "Westin, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Always. Victoria Ashworth, you were engaged to her once, weren't you?" The directness of the question caught him off guard, though he realized he shouldn't have been surprised. Delia had always been perceptive, and the tension during Victoria's visit had been palpable. "Yes," he admitted. 3 years ago. It lasted about 6 months. "What happened?" Westin leaned back in his chair, considering how much to reveal. "She found someone who could offer her more than I could." "More money?" Delia asked, incredulous. "How is that possible?" "Not more money," Westin clarified. "More ambition, more willingness to play society games, more interest in building a social empire rather than just maintaining what already exists." Delia studied his face in the lamplight, seeing something there that made her heart ache. "She hurt you." "She bruised my pride," Westin corrected. "But if I'm honest, she did me a favor. That engagement was based on expectation rather than affection. I thought it was what I wanted because it was what I was supposed to want. And now?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Westin looked at this woman, who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying, who'd brought warmth and purpose to rooms that had felt empty for too long. "Now I know the difference between what I'm supposed to want and what I actually want," he said quietly. Delia's breath caught. "Westin." "I know it's complicated," he continued, leaning forward in his chair. "I know there are obstacles, social expectations, practical considerations, the fact that we come from different worlds. But Delia, these past weeks with you and the boys have been the happiest of my adult life." The honesty in his words was both thrilling and terrifying. Delia felt tears prick her eyes as she struggled with her own conflicted feelings. "I care about you too," she whispered, "more than I should. But caring isn't enough, is it? There are realities we can't ignore." "What realities?" "You're Westin Hale, heir to one of the largest cattle empires in the territory. I'm a widow with no money and 2 young children. People like Victoria Ashworth will always see me as an opportunist who trapped you with her circumstances." "Do you care what Victoria Ashworth thinks?" "I care what everyone thinks," Delia said, her voice growing stronger. "Because their opinions affect you, whether you want to admit it or not. They affect your business relationships, your standing in the community, your future." Westin stood and moved around the desk, settling into the chair beside hers. "Delia, look at me." Reluctantly, she met his eyes. "My business relationships are built on profit, not social approval. My standing in the community comes from my family's reputation and my own actions, not from who I choose to love. And as for my future," he reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I can't imagine one without you and the boys in it." The words she'd been longing to hear were also the ones she'd been dreading. They made everything more real, more complicated, more dangerous for all of them. "The twins already think of you as a father figure," she said softly. "If this doesn't work out, if we try and fail, it won't just be my heart that breaks." "Then we won't fail," Westin said simply. "We'll take it slowly, carefully. We'll give the community time to adjust to the idea. But Delia, I'm not willing to give up what we're building here because of other people's prejudices." Before she could respond, the sound of small feet in the hallway caught their attention. Tommy appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep and his face creased with worry. "Mama, I heard voices. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Delia said, opening her arms to him. "Mr. Westin and I were just talking about ranch business." Tommy climbed into her lap, but his eyes went to Westin with the trust that had developed between them over the past weeks. "Mr. Westin, are you sad about something? You look sad." Out of the mouths of babes, Westin managed a smile, reaching over to ruffle the boy's hair. "Not sad, Tommy. Just thinking about important things. Sometimes grown-ups have to make big decisions, and that can look like sadness even when it's not." "What kind of decisions?" Westin glanced at Delia, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Well," Westin said carefully, "I've been thinking about how much I like having you and Jamie and your mama here, and I've been wondering if maybe you'd like to stay permanently." Tommy's face lit up like sunrise. "Forever and ever?" "If your mama agrees, yes. Forever and ever." The little boy looked between them with the wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Would that make you and mama married?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Delia felt her cheeks burn, but Westin answered with characteristic directness. "Someday, if your mama wants to be married to me. But first we need to be sure it's the right thing for everyone." "I think it's the right thing," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "Jamie thinks so too. We talked about it." "You talked about it?" Delia asked, surprised. "Uh-huh. We like it here. We like Mr. Westin. And we want to stay forever." Tommy paused, then added with devastating innocence, "Besides, Papa would want us to be happy, wouldn't he?" The mention of Samuel brought tears to Delia's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt his presence as a blessing rather than a burden, as if he were giving her permission to love again. "Yes," she whispered, "Papa would want us to be happy." An hour later, after Tommy had been settled back in his bed, with promises that nothing would change overnight, Westin and Delia stood together on the front porch, looking out over the moonlit ranchlands. "It's not going to be easy," Delia said quietly. "People will talk. Some will disapprove." "Let them," Westin replied, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "I've spent too many years living for other people's approval. I'd rather spend the rest of my life making you and the boys happy." In the distance, a night bird called to its mate, the sound carrying across the quiet prairie like a promise. Delia leaned into Westin's warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek and the solid strength of his presence beside her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, with the rings safely locked away and the future spread before them like an unwritten page, anything seemed possible. The legal documents arrived on a crisp October morning, delivered by a stern-faced lawyer from Denver, who requested a private meeting with Westin immediately. Mrs. Henderson showed the man into the study, while Delia was in the office working on the monthly accounts, the twins playing quietly nearby with their wooden toys. She didn't think much of it at first. Westin's business often required legal consultations, contract reviews, property transactions. But when raised voices began filtering through the closed study door, followed by a long, ominous silence, she found herself straining to hear what was being discussed. 20 minutes later, the lawyer emerged, his expression grim but satisfied. He tipped his hat to Mrs. Henderson and departed without another word, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate the entire house. Westin didn't appear for lunch. When Delia knocked on his study door, he called for her to enter in a voice that sounded utterly defeated. She found him standing at the window, his back to the door, a stack of official-looking papers spread across his desk. The set of his shoulders told her that whatever news the lawyer had brought, it was devastating. "Westin, what's happened?" He turned, and the expression on his face made her blood run cold. It was the look of a man who'd been backed into a corner with no way out. "Victoria's back from San Francisco," he said quietly, "and she's brought lawyers with her." Delia moved closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the documents spread there. She could make out phrases like breach of contract and property settlement and binding agreement, but the legal language was mostly incomprehensible to her. "I don't understand," she said. "What kind of contract?" Westin picked up the top document, his hands trembling slightly. "A prenuptial agreement her father insisted on before our engagement." Apparently, breaking off the engagement didn't void all its provisions. What provisions? If I take another wife within 5 years of our broken engagement, Victoria's entitled to claim half of all property acquired during the period of our betrothal. Westin's voice was hollow. Including this ranch. Delia felt the world tilt around her. Half the ranch? But that's impossible. Surely no court would uphold such a thing. Victoria's new husband has connections throughout the territorial court system. Her lawyers seem confident they can make it stick, especially given... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Given what? Given that I'm living in sin with a woman and her bastard children. The crude words hit Delia like physical blows. She sank into a chair, her mind reeling as the implications crashed over her. They know about us, she whispered. They know about everything. How long you've been here, the sleeping arrangements, the fact that I've been supporting you and the boys. Westin's face was grey with fury and frustration. Victoria has had people watching the ranch, gathering evidence to support her claim that I've violated the moral standards expected of a man in my position. Delia's hands went to her throat, finding the silver locket that had become her anchor in times of crisis. What does this mean? What are our options? Westin was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the papers that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. Victoria is offering a settlement, he said finally. If I marry her within 30 days, she'll withdraw the lawsuit and waive her claim to the ranch. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Delia felt something cold and hard settle in her chest as the full scope of Victoria's manipulation became clear. She planned this, Delia said, her voice barely above a whisper. The broken engagement, the marriage to someone else, the timing of her return. She's been waiting for you to care about someone so she could use it against you. It appears so. And if you refuse, then we go to court, where a territorial judge will decide whether a wealthy widow with questionable morals is worth losing half of everything my family built over 3 generations. The clinical way he described her situation made Delia flinch, even though she knew he was merely stating how others would see her. There's something else, Westin continued, his voice growing even more strained. Victoria's lawyers have filed papers questioning the legitimacy of the twins' parentage. They're suggesting that if I've been harboring another man's illegitimate children, it speaks to my own moral character. They can't do that, Delia gasped. The boys are Samuel's sons. I have their birth certificates, our marriage certificate. I know that, and you know that. But Victoria's people are very good at making innocent situations look sordid. They're painting a picture of a desperate widow who seduced a wealthy rancher and trapped him with her circumstances. The injustice of it took Delia's breath away. Everything they'd built together, the trust, the growing love, the sense of family, was being twisted into something ugly and calculated. How long do we have? She asked. 30 days from yesterday. 29 days to decide between love and financial ruin. 29 days to choose between the woman he'd come to love and the legacy his grandfather had built with his own hands. Westin, Delia said carefully, you know what you have to do. He looked up sharply. Do I? You have to marry her. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she forced herself to continue. You can't lose the ranch because of us. Your family's legacy, all those people who depend on you for their livelihoods, you can't sacrifice all of that. And what about you and the boys? Delia's hand tightened on the locket, drawing strength from the small photographs inside. We'll manage. We did it before. We can do it again. Absolutely not. Westin's voice was firm. I'm not going to abandon you to that witch's machinations. Then what's your alternative? Fight this in court and risk losing everything? If that's what it takes. And when you lose, when Victoria gets half the ranch anyway and we're all left with nothing, what happens to Mrs. Henderson, to old Pete, to all the ranch hands who've worked here for years? What happens to the twins when they're thrown back into poverty because you chose love over responsibility? Each word was like a knife in her heart. But Delia knew she had to make him see the impossible position Victoria had put them in. There has to be another way, Westin said desperately. There is, Delia replied quietly. I leave. Tonight. Take the boys and disappear before Victoria can use us against you anymore. No. The word came out sharp and final. I won't let you run. I won't let her win. Then marry her, Delia said, standing to face him across the desk. Marry her and keep your ranch and your legacy intact. It's the only choice that makes sense. The only choice that makes sense, Westin repeated, his voice bitter. And what about love, Delia? What about the family we've built here? What about everything we mean to each other? Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. Sometimes love means making the hard choice. Sometimes it means sacrificing your own happiness for the greater good. Don't you dare quote nobility at me. Westin snapped, his own emotions finally breaking through his careful control. Don't you dare stand there and tell me that marrying a woman I despise is the noble thing to do. It's the practical thing to do, Delia shot back, and sometimes that's all we have. The sound of children's laughter drifted in from outside, where Tommy and Jamie were playing with the ranch dogs, blissfully unaware that their world was about to crumble around them again. I need time to think, Westin said finally, sinking into his chair like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. We don't have time, Delia replied. We have 29 days, and every one of them that passes makes Victoria's case stronger. As she left the study, closing the door softly behind her, Delia allowed herself one moment of pure grief for the life she'd almost had. Then she straightened her shoulders, touched the locket at her throat, and began planning for the hardest conversation she'd ever have to have with her children. Because one way or another, their time at the Hale ranch was coming to an end. The blank marriage certificate lay on Westin's desk like an accusation, its empty lines waiting to be filled with names that would determine the fate of everyone he'd come to love. Victoria's lawyer had delivered it that morning, along with a reminder that only 24 hours remained until the deadline. 24 hours to choose between duty and desire, between financial security and personal happiness, between the woman who'd captured his heart and the legacy his family had spent 3 generations building. Westin stared at the document until the words blurred together, then pushed back from his desk and walked to the window. Outside, autumn had painted the ranch in shades of gold and crimson, and the sight of his grandfather's land stretching to the horizon, reminded him of everything that hung in the balance. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting Mrs. Henderson with coffee or perhaps another message from Victoria's lawyers. Instead, Delia entered, carrying a small carpet bag and wearing her traveling dress, the same faded blue garment she'd been wearing the morning he found her by the dying campfire. The sight of it sent a chill through his bones. "What are you doing?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "What I should have done days ago," she replied quietly, setting the bag down by the door. "I'm leaving, tonight, after the boys are asleep." "Absolutely not. Westin, please don't make this harder than it already is." Her voice was steady, but he could see the pain in her green eyes. "Every day I stay makes Victoria's case stronger. Every night we spend under the same roof gives her more ammunition to use against you. I don't care about Victoria's case." "Well, you should care." Delia moved to the desk, her eyes falling on the marriage certificate. "Because in 24 hours you're going to marry her." "Like hell I am." "Look at this," Delia said, picking up the certificate with trembling fingers. "Look at what your choice really is. You can fill in Victoria's name and keep everything: your ranch, your family's legacy, the livelihoods of everyone who depends on you. Or you can throw it all away for a woman who brought you nothing but trouble from the moment you met her." "You brought me everything," Westin said fiercely. "You brought me love, purpose, a reason to come home each day. You brought me a family. I brought you scandal and legal troubles and the risk of losing everything your grandfather worked for." Delia set the certificate down with careful precision. "I won't be responsible for that destruction." Before Westin could respond, the office door burst open and Tommy came running in, his face bright with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Westin, Jamie and me saw a shooting star. Mrs. Henderson says if you make a wish on a shooting star, it comes true." The innocent joy in the boy's voice was like a knife in both adults' hearts. Delia knelt down to Tommy's level, struggling to keep her composure. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. What did you wish for?" "I wish that we could stay here forever and ever," Tommy said solemnly. "And that you and Mr. Westin would get married so we could be a real family." The words hung in the air like a prayer and a condemnation all at once. Westin saw Delia's face crumple for just a moment before she managed to school her features back into maternal calm. "Tommy," she said gently, "sometimes wishes don't come true the way we want them to, but that doesn't mean we stop hoping for good things." "But why can't this wish come true?" Tommy asked, with the devastating logic of childhood. "Mr. Westin loves us, and we love him, and you love him too, I can tell." Out of the mouths of babes, Westin crouched down beside Delia, his heart breaking at the confusion in the little boy's face. "Tommy, sometimes grown-ups have to make very difficult decisions. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the thing we want to do." "I don't understand," Tommy said, his lower lip beginning to tremble. "I know you don't, son, and I wish I could explain it better." The word son slipped out naturally, and Westin realized with painful clarity that somewhere along the way, that's exactly what Tommy and Jamie had become to him. Not just Delia's children that he was fond of, but his boys in every way that mattered. "Mr. Westin," Tommy said, his voice very small, "are we going away again?" The question was directed at Westin, but it was Delia who answered. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to take a trip." "But I don't want to go on a trip," Tommy wailed, tears starting to flow. "I want to stay here with Mr. Westin and the horses, and Mrs. Henderson and Cookie." Before either adult could respond, Jamie appeared in the doorway, drawn by his twins' distress. Within moments, both boys were crying, clinging to Westin and begging him not to let them go. "I'm sorry," Delia whispered, tears streaming down her own face as she tried to gently disengage the boys from Westin's arms. "I'm so sorry." "Mama, no," Jamie sobbed. "We don't want to leave. Please don't make us leave." The sound of the children's heartbreak was more than Westin could bear. He stood abruptly, his decision crystallizing with sudden, perfect clarity. "Nobody's leaving," he said firmly. Delia looked up sharply. "Westin." "Nobody's leaving," he repeated, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd finally chosen his path. "Mrs. Henderson." The housekeeper appeared within moments, alerted by the children's crying. "Mrs. Henderson, please take the boys to the kitchen and ask Cookie to make them some hot chocolate. They've had a scare, but everything's going to be all right." "Of course, Mr. Westin." Mrs. Henderson gathered the twins with practiced efficiency, murmuring soothing words as she led them away. When they were alone again, Westin turned to face Delia with newfound determination. "I'm not marrying Victoria Ashworth," he said flatly. "Westin, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. I'm choosing love over money, family over property, happiness over obligation." He picked up the marriage certificate and before Delia could stop him, tore it cleanly in half. "I'd rather lose everything and keep you than keep everything and lose you." "But the ranch is just land and buildings," Westin interrupted. "What makes it home is the people in it. You, the boys, Mrs. Henderson, old Pete, all of them. If Victoria wants to try to take half of it, let her try. But I won't give her the satisfaction of destroying what we've built here." Delia stared at the torn certificate, her mind reeling. "You'll lose everything. Your grandfather's legacy, your family's name, the security of everyone who works here. My grandfather built this place with his bare hands because he believed in the American dream that a man could make his own destiny, choose his own path." Westin moved closer to her, his voice intense with conviction. "What kind of legacy would I be honoring if I let fear and greed dictate my choices? But Victoria's lawyers are counting on me being too scared to fight. They're betting that I'll choose the easy path over the right one." Westin's jaw set with determination. "They're about to learn how wrong they are." Before Delia could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was one of the ranch hands, hat in hand, and expression grim. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Hale, but there's riders coming up the road. Looks like that fancy carriage from Denver, plus some men on horseback." "Victoria, coming for her answer with an entourage to witness either his capitulation or his destruction. "How long do we have?" Westin asked. "Maybe 20 minutes, sir." "Thank you, Jim. Ask Mrs. Henderson to prepare tea for our guests, and ask her to make sure the boys stay in the kitchen until this is finished." As the ranch hand departed, Westin turned back to Delia with an expression that was both tender and resolute. "I need you to trust me," he said quietly. "Can you do that?" "Westin, I'm terrified, not for myself, but for you, for the boys, for everyone who's been so kind to us." "I'm terrified too," he admitted, "but I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life regretting the choice I didn't make than I am of fighting for what I believe in." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the creak of expensive carriage wheels. Victoria Ashworth was coming to collect what she considered her due, confident that she'd backed Westin into a corner with no way out. She was about to discover that cornered animals fight the hardest. "Whatever happens in the next hour," Westin said, taking Delia's hands in his, "I want you to know that these past months have been the best of my life. You and the boys gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." "What was that?" "A reason to be better than I was." He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Whatever Victoria throws at us, we'll face it together. And if we lose, then we'll lose together, and maybe that's a different kind of winning." The carriage was pulling into the yard now, followed by several mounted men who looked like the kind of hired muscle that money could buy. Through the window, Westin could see Victoria stepping down from the carriage, resplendent in a burgundy dress that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. "She's brought witnesses," Delia observed, her voice tight with apprehension. "Good," Westin replied grimly. "Then there will be plenty of people to hear what I have to say." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Ashworth and her party are requesting an audience, Mr. Westin. Shall I show them to the parlor?" "No," Westin said, straightening his shoulders and squaring his jaw. "Show them to the front porch. What I have to say to Mrs. Ashworth doesn't require the privacy of my home." As they prepared to face Victoria's final ultimatum, Delia found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that desperate morning by the dying campfire to this confrontation that would determine their future, every step had led them here. She thought about the blank marriage certificate, now torn in half and scattered on Westin's desk like the remnants of a dream deferred. Tomorrow, if they survived Victoria's assault, perhaps there would be time to fill out a different certificatone that joined two hearts by choice rather than coercion. But first, they had to win a battle that seemed impossible to win, against an enemy who held all the cards and showed no mercy. As they walked toward the front door together, Delia touched the silver locket at her throat one last time, drawing strength from the photographs of her children and the memory of Samuel's gentle wisdom. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest act of love was not the grand gesture, but the simple decision to stand and fight when running would be easier. Today, they would find out if love was strong enough to overcome law, if justice could triumph over manipulation, and if a family built on choice and commitment could withstand the assault of those who saw relationships only as transactions to be negotiated. The front door opened, and Victoria Ashworth's smile was as cold and beautiful as winter sunlight on ice. Victoria Ashworth stood on the front porch of the Hale ranch like a queen holding court, her burgundy wedding dress rustling in the autumn breeze. The elaborate gown was clearly chosen for effect silk taffeta with seed pearl beading, a bustle that spoke of the latest Eastern fashions, and a train that whispered against the porch boards with every movement. She looked every inch the wealthy socialite, a woman born to privilege and accustomed to getting her way. "Westin," she said warmly, as if they were old friends meeting for tea instead of adversaries in a legal battle. "How lovely to see you again. I do hope you've had time to consider my proposal." Behind her stood 3 men, her lawyer, stern and confident in his expensive suit, a territorial judge who looked uncomfortable but determined. and a man Westin didn't recognize, but who had the bearing of hired authority. "Victoria," Westin replied evenly, not moving from his position beside Delia. "I've considered it very carefully." "Wonderful." Victoria's smile was radiant with anticipated victory. "Then we can proceed with the ceremony immediately. Judge Morrison has graciously agreed to perform the service here and now, saving us all the trouble of traveling to town." The presumption in her words was breathtaking. She'd arrived with a judge, a wedding dress, and the absolute certainty that Westin would capitulate to her demands. It was, Delia realized, the culmination of years of manipulation, the broken engagement, the strategic marriage to someone else, the careful timing of her return. All of it designed to bring them to this moment. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Westin said calmly. "I won't be marrying you today, Victoria, or any other day." The smile never left Victoria's face, but something cold and calculating flickered in her eyes. "Oh, but I think you will. You see, I've brought more than just a judge today." She gestured to the third man, who stepped forward with official bearing. "This is Marshal Crawford from the Territorial Court. He has some very interesting documents regarding the moral fitness of guardians for minor children." Delia felt the blood drain from her face as the marshal produced a sheaf of papers from his coat. "Mrs. Morgan," the marshal said formally, "I have here a court order questioning your fitness as a mother, given your current living arrangements. The territory takes a dim view of children being raised in situations of moral ambiguity." "What are you saying?" Delia's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm saying that unless this situation is resolved today, those children will be placed in territorial custody pending a full investigation into their welfare." The marshal's voice was professionally neutral, but Delia could hear the threat underneath. Victoria's smile widened. "Of course, if Westin and I were to marry today, the situation would be resolved immediately. I would be happy to serve as a proper maternal influence for the children, ensuring they're raised in a morally appropriate household." The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Victoria wasn't just threatening Westin's ranch, she was threatening to take Delia's children. "You can't do this," Delia said, her voice breaking. "They're my sons. Children whose welfare is currently in question due to their mother's choices." Victoria replied smoothly, "But don't worry, my dear. Once Westin and I are married, I'm sure we can work out suitable arrangements for their care." Suitable arrangements. The phrase sent ice through Delia's veins. She could picture exactly what Victoria had in mind. The twins sent away to some distant boarding facility, removed from their mother's influence and raised by strangers. "Westin," Victoria continued, turning her attention back to her primary target, "surely you can see that this is the best solution for everyone. You keep your ranch, the children are provided for in a respectable household, and Mrs. Morgan is free to make a fresh start somewhere far from here. The subtext was clear: marry me or watch the family you love be destroyed piece by piece." Westin was silent for a long moment, and Delia could see the agony in his face as he weighed impossible choices: lose the ranch or lose the children. Fight Victoria in court, or watch Tommy and Jamie disappear into the territorial system. "I need a moment to consider," Westin said finally. "Of course," Victoria said graciously, "but I'm afraid time is rather short. Judge Morrison has other appointments today." As Westin stepped aside with Delia, supposedly to discuss their options privately, Victoria's attention was caught by movement in the ranch yard. Mrs. Henderson was approaching with a tea service, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came Old Pete Cookie and several of the ranch hands, all moving with purpose toward the house. "What's this?" Victoria asked, her confidence flickering for the first time. "I believe," Westin said, returning to face her with renewed determination, "that my employees have something to say about your allegations." Mrs. Henderson set down the tea service with deliberate care, then turned to face Victoria with 15 years of accumulated authority. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I've been managing this household for a long time, and I feel compelled to speak to the moral character of this family." "This is hardly necessary," Victoria's lawyer interjected. "Oh, but I think it is," Old Pete said, stepping forward with his hat in his hands, but his chin raised proudly. "You see, we've all been watching this family for months now, and we've got something to say about what we've seen." One by one, the ranch employees began to speak. Mrs. Henderson testified to Delia's tireless work ethic and devoted motherhood. Cookie described the boys' polite behavior and the obvious love between mother and children. The ranch hands spoke of Westin's transformation from a distant employer to a man who clearly cherished his newfound family. Furthermore, Mrs. Henderson concluded, "I've been present for every interaction between Mr. Westin and Mrs. Morgan. Their conduct has been above reproach at all times. Any suggestion otherwise is a slander against two of the finest people I've ever known." Victoria's composure was beginning to crack as she realized her carefully constructed narrative was falling apart in the face of unified testimony from respected members of the community. "This is all very touching," she said, her voice sharp with frustration, "but it doesn't change the legal realities. The contract stands, and the children's welfare is still in question." "Actually," came a new voice from the direction of the road, "I think you'll find that both of those assumptions are incorrect." Everyone turned to see another carriage approaching this one, bearing the insignia of the Territorial Attorney General's office. The man who stepped down was middle-aged, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to courtrooms and legal battles. "Mr. Jameson," Westin said with obvious relief, "thank you for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," the lawyer replied, his eyes taking in the scene with keen interest. "Especially not when I learned that certain parties were attempting to enforce contracts that violate territorial law." Victoria's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about prenuptial agreements that attempt to control future behavior through financial coercion," Jameson said calmly. "The territory doesn't recognize contracts that essentially amount to extortion, particularly when they involve moral clauses that could be interpreted as restraint of trade in personal relationships." The judge who'd accompanied Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Jameson, surely." "Judge Morrison, I'm surprised to see you here. I wasn't aware that territorial judges were in the habit of performing coercive marriages." Jameson's tone was mild, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. As the legal tide turned against her, Victoria played her final card. "What about the children's welfare?" she demanded. "Surely the territory has an interest in ensuring proper moral guidance." "Indeed we do," Jameson agreed, "which is why I'm prepared to testify that removing children from a loving, stable home would constitute a grave injustice. Mrs. Morgan's fitness as a mother is not in question, and any attempt to suggest otherwise based on her current living arrangements would be seen as harassment." The marshal who delivered the custody threat was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, perhaps we should reconsider." "No," Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. "This isn't over. I won't let some opportunistic widow steal what should be mine." The ugly truth was finally out. This had never been about law or morality or the children's welfare. It had been about Victoria's wounded pride and her determination to control Westin's life, even if she didn't want it for herself. The silence that followed Victoria's outburst was deafening. Her elegant mask had finally slipped, revealing the petty vindictiveness underneath, and everyone present could see her for what she truly was, a woman, so consumed by her own sense of entitlement that she was willing to destroy innocent lives to get her way. Westin stepped forward, his voice carrying across the porch with quiet authority. "Victoria, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because I'll only say it once." She turned to face him, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, the elaborate wedding dress now seeming almost grotesque in its presumption. "3 years ago, when you broke our engagement to marry someone else, I thought you'd destroyed my life," Westin continued. "Now I realize you gave me the greatest gift possible. You showed me what I didn't want before I was foolish enough to settle for it." "How dare you?" "I'm not finished." Westin's voice cut through her protest like a blade. "You've spent months plotting this elaborate scheme, thinking you could manipulate me into a loveless marriage by threatening everything I hold dear. But you made one crucial mistake." "What mistake?" Victoria spat. You assumed that the ranch, the money, the social position you assumed, those things mattered more to me than the people I love. Westin moved to stand beside Delia, his hand finding hers with natural ease. You were wrong. He turned to address the lawyer, Jameson. Mr. Jameson, I'd like you to witness my formal rejection of any claim Mrs. Ashworth believes she has to my property or my person. I choose to fight this in court, if necessary, regardless of the outcome. Westin, no, Delia whispered, squeezing his hand. You could lose everything. I could lose everything that doesn't matter, he corrected gently, but I'll keep everything that does. Victoria's lawyer stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had devolved. Mr. Hale, perhaps we could discuss a settlement. There will be no settlement, Westin said firmly. Mrs. Ashworth has shown her true character today, and I have no intention of rewarding extortion. Then you'll face us in court, Victoria said venomously, and we'll see how much your precious love is worth when you're bankrupt. Actually, Jameson interjected, I don't think you will. All eyes turned to the territorial attorney as he produced his own set of documents. You see, while Mrs. Ashworth has been plotting her legal assault, I've been doing some investigating of my own. It seems her late husband's business dealings weren't entirely above board. Victoria's face went white. What are you talking about? Railroad fraud, specifically, inflated construction costs, bribes to territorial officials, falsified survey reports, the kind of thing that could result in federal charges if the right prosecutor decided to pursue them. But he's dead, Victoria protested. You can't prosecute a dead man. No, but we can prosecute his surviving beneficiaries who knowingly profited from illegal activities. Jameson's smile was coldly professional. Amazing what a thorough audit can uncover, particularly when conducted by federal marshals with subpoena power. The threat was clear: pursue her vendetta against Westin and face federal prosecution for her husband's crimes. Victoria looked around desperately, seeking support from her allies, but found only uncomfortable silence. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps, given the circumstances, it would be best if all parties simply moved on. No lawsuits, no further legal action. A clean slate for everyone involved. Agreed, Jameson said immediately. Mr. Hale is willing to let this matter drop entirely, provided Mrs. Ashworth withdraws all claims and ceases any further harassment of his household. Victoria stood frozen for a long moment, her elaborate wedding dress rustling in the wind as she realized her carefully constructed plan had collapsed completely. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with barely controlled rage. This isn't over, Westin. You'll regret choosing that woman over your family's legacy. My family's legacy, Westin replied calmly, will be the children I raise and the love I build, not the money I inherit. You're welcome to your bitterness, Victoria, but you're not welcome here. As Victoria and her entourage prepared to leave, Delia felt a small hand slip into hers. Tommy had appeared beside her, having apparently escaped Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye in the kitchen. "Mama," he said quietly, "is the mean lady going away now?" "Yes, sweetheart," Delia replied, kneeling down to his level. "She's going away and she won't be back." "Good," Tommy said with the simple honesty of childhood. "She made you sad, and she made Mr. Westin worry. We don't like people who do that." As Victoria's carriage disappeared down the road, taking with it the threat that had loomed over them for weeks, Westin turned to face the small crowd that had gathered to support them. "I want to thank all of you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your loyalty today meant more than I can express." "No thanks needed, Mr. Westin," old Pete said gruffly. "This is family business, and family sticks together." Family. There was that word again, encompassing not just blood relations, but all the people who'd chosen to care for one another. As the ranch hands dispersed back to their duties and Mrs. Henderson shepherded Tommy back to the kitchen, Westin and Delia found themselves alone on the porch where it had all begun. "Is it really over?" Delia asked, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare was finally ending. "It's over," Westin confirmed. Victoria's too smart to risk federal prosecution, and Jameson's made it clear that any further action would trigger a full investigation into her finances. And us? What happens to us now? Westin reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something small and simply a plain gold band that gleamed softly in the afternoon sunlight. It was nothing like the elaborate diamond ring he'd once given Victoria, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. "Now," he said, dropping to one knee on the porch where he'd first offered her shelter, "I ask you properly, Delia Morgan, will you marry me? Not because of legal contracts or social expectations, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life making you and the boys happy." Tears streaming down her face, Delia looked at this man who'd risked everything for love, who'd chosen family over fortune and connection over convention. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "Yes," she said simply, "yes, with all my heart." As Westin slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the kitchen, where Tommy and Jamie were no doubt charming extra cookies from Cookie's supposedly firm reserves. It was the sound of home, of family, of dreams fulfilled against all odds. They'd weathered the storm together, and now they could begin building the life they'd both dreamed of, not perfect, perhaps, but real and honest and filled with the kind of love that chose to fight rather than surrender, to hope rather than despair, to trust in the future rather than be bound by the past. The simple gold band caught the light as Delia raised her hand to touch Westin's face, and in that moment she knew that Samuel would have approved. Love, after all, was never about replacing what was lost, but about having the courage to build something new and beautiful from the ashes of old sorrows. Tomorrow, they would plan a wedding. Tonight, they would simply hold each other and marvel at the miracle of surviving love's greatest test, with their hearts not only intact, but stronger than ever. 6 months later, the new family portrait hung in the front parlor of the Hale ranch house, a testament to the power of love to transform lives and create beauty from the ashes of despair. The painted canvas showed Westin in his finest suit, one hand resting on Delia's shoulder as she sat in a chair wearing the ivory silk dress he'd commissioned for their wedding. Tommy and Jamie stood on either side, their faces bright with the confidence that came from being deeply loved and completely secure. But it was the small details that told the real story. Westin's gentle smile as he looked not at the artist, but at his wife, Delia's hand covering his where it rested on her shoulder, the way the twins leaned naturally against their parents with the easy intimacy of children who'd never known a moment's doubt about their place in the family. The artist, a traveling painter from Denver, had captured something precious in those careful brush strokes, the peace that settled over faces that had known hardship and found grace, the joy that radiated from hearts that had chosen love over fear. "It's beautiful, Mrs. Henderson said, standing beside Delia as they admired the finished work. "Though I still say he made you prettier than you already are, which I didn't think was possible." Delia laughed, her hand moving instinctively to rest on the gentle swell of her abdomen where new life was growing. The pregnancy had been a surprise, a gift neither she nor Westin had dared to hope for, but one that completed their family in ways they hadn't even realized were missing. "Where did Westin go?" Delia asked, noting her husband's absence from the room. "Out to the barn with the boys," Mrs. Henderson replied with a knowing smile. "Something about a surprise that couldn't wait until your birthday tomorrow." Through the parlor window, Delia could see the three of them bent over something in the barn doorway, their heads close together in the conspiratorial way of males, planning something special for the women they loved. Tommy and Jamie, now 4 years old and growing stronger every day, had embraced their role as big brothers, with the solemnity of children entrusted with important responsibilities. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where a familiar figure was riding toward the house, Dr. Mitchell making his monthly visit to check on both Delia and the baby she carried. It was a precaution that Westin insisted upon, despite Delia's protests that she felt perfectly fine. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hale," the doctor said as he climbed the front steps, medical bag in hand. "How are we feeling today?" "Wonderful," Delia replied honestly, "though I think my husband is more nervous about this pregnancy than I am." "First-time fathers often are," Dr. Mitchell said with a chuckle, "even when they've already proven themselves capable with older children." Indeed, Westin had taken to fatherhood with a natural grace that surprised no one who'd witnessed his patient teaching of the twins over the past months. He'd formally adopted Tommy and Jamie shortly after the wedding, a legal ceremony that had been far more emotional than either adult had expected. Watching the boys sign their shaky new names, Tommy Hale and Jamie Hale, had reduced both parents to happy tears. After Dr. Mitchell had completed his examination and pronounced both mother and child perfectly healthy, Delia made her way to the barn to investigate the mysterious project that had consumed her family's attention all afternoon. She found them putting the finishing touches on a beautiful wooden cradle carved with the same careful attention to detail that Westin had shown in creating the twins' toys. But this was different. This was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with delicate roses carved into the headboard and the Hale family crest worked into the footboard. "It's magnificent," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "We all worked on it," Tommy announced proudly. "Me and Jamie helped sand the wood, and Mr. Westin, Papa did all the fancy carving." "Papa." The word still made Westin's eyes shine every time one of the boys said it. He'd waited 30 years to be someone's father, and he approached the role with the same dedication he brought to everything else he cared about. "Do you think the baby will like it?" Jamie asked seriously. "I think the baby will love it," Delia assured him, pulling both boys close for a hug, "almost as much as he or she will love having such wonderful big brothers." As evening approached and the twins were settled in their beds now, decorated with all manner of carved animals and painted scenes that Westin had created over the months, Delia and her husband sat together on the front porch swing they'd installed after the wedding. The swing had been Delia's idea, inspired by memories of her own childhood and a desire to create new traditions for their growing family. On warm evenings like this, they would sit together and watch the sun set over the ranch lands, planning for the future and marveling at how far they'd traveled from that desperate morning by the dying campfire. "Any word from Victoria?" Delia asked, though she asked more from curiosity than concern. "Jameson says she's living quietly in San Francisco, apparently having learned her lesson about the dangers of pursuing grudges," Westin replied. Her late husband's business associates weren't pleased to have federal attention drawn to their affairs. "I suspect she's been advised to avoid anything that might bring further scrutiny." It was hard to imagine the vindictive woman who'd tried to destroy their happiness living a quiet life, but perhaps even Victoria Ashworth was capable of learning from her mistakes. "I've been thinking," Delia said, settling more comfortably against Westin's side, "about names for the baby. And if it's a boy, I'd like to name him Samuel, after my first husband, but also because it means heard by God. This whole family feels like an answer to prayers I was afraid to pray." Westin was quiet for a moment, considering. "And if it's a girl?" "Grace," Delia said without hesitation, "because that's what all of this has been, unearned grace that transformed our lives." "Samuel Hale or Grace Hale," Westin mused. "Both have a nice sound to them." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Delia thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The silver locket still rested at her throat, but now it held new photographs, their wedding picture, and a recent image of the twins laughing as they played with the ranch dogs. She'd never forgotten Samuel, would always treasure the love they'd shared and the children he'd given her. But she'd learned that the heart was capable of infinite expansion, that love didn't diminish when divided, but multiplied when shared. "Delia," Westin said quietly, "do you ever regret it? Staying here, marrying me, taking on all the complications that came with this life?" She turned to study his face in the lamplight, seeing the vulnerability there that he rarely showed anyone else. Even now, after months of marriage and mounting evidence of their happiness, He sometimes seemed amazed that she'd chosen him. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment. This life, this family, this love, it's everything I never dared dream of having. Even when Victoria threatened to take the boys, even when it looked like we might lose everything." "Especially then," Delia replied, "because that's when I knew for certain that you'd choose us over everything else. That's when I knew our love was real." In the distance, a night bird called to its mate, the sound carrying across the quiet ranch lands like a benediction. The cradle waiting in the barn seemed to symbolize not just the coming baby, but the future they were building together, legacy of love that would outlast any material wealth. "What are you thinking about?" Westin asked, noting her contemplative expression. "About how sometimes the worst moments in our lives turn out to be doorways to the best ones," Delia said. "About how desperation led me to hope, and hope led me to you." "Follow me home," Westin said softly, echoing the words that had changed everything. "Those were the first words I said to you that mattered." "And now home isn't a place," Delia replied, her hand finding his in the familiar gesture of love and partnership. "It's wherever we are, together." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnesses to countless love stories played out beneath their light. But tonight, they shone down on a family that had been forged not by blood or convenience, but by choice and courage, and the simple faith that some dreams are worth fighting for. In the morning, there would be cattle to tend and accounts to balance and children to teach and love. Tonight, there was only this peace, contentment, and the profound satisfaction that came from knowing they'd built something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of old sorrows. The porch swing creaked gently as they rocked together, and Delia closed her eyes, listening to the sound of her husband's heartbeat and feeling the gentle flutter of new life beneath her heart. She was exactly where she belonged, where she'd always been meant to be, where love had finally brought her home.